Like the video, subscribe, and comment your country below so I know who's listening tonight. Turn off the lights and put on headphones for the full horror experience. Let's begin the nightmare. If you're brave enough. I never planned on writing any of this down, because out here, stories don't matter, evidence does. Yet even evidence isn't enough when you're dealing with something that feels older than trees and smarter than men. But I need to get this out before I forget the order of things, before the sounds in the forest start mixing with the memories in my head. So let me start from the beginning. On the first day, I was assigned to Silent Lake National Park, a sprawling, heavily wooded reserve tucked into the northwest ridge of the state, famous for its fog, its enormous stretches of untouched wilderness, and infamous for its missing persons record, though the brochures politely call them unsolved disappearances, and most visitors chalk them up to accidents, animal attacks, or foolishness. But the rangers who had been here long enough looked at the woods like survivors look at their trauma, never fully healed, always waiting for the next thing to go wrong. And I didn't understand that at first. I thought they were just superstitious old men, until I learned what actually lived out there, because it wasn't bears, coyotes, or wolves. It was something else entirely, something that hunts differently, watches differently, moves differently, and waits with patience no wild animal should have. And the first sign of it appeared the moment I stepped into the ranger cabin, a large wooden structure with old maps stapled to the walls, outdated radio equipment, and a permanent smell of wet leaves and mold, where I met Ranger Thomas, a wiry old man with silver hair and a face carved like bark, who looked me up and down with a stare that told me he had already decided whether I would survive this place or not, and without bothering to shake my hand, he said, "If you hear knocking past midnight, don't answer it, don't speak to it, don't acknowledge it." And I laughed because I assumed it was a hazing joke, but he didn't laugh with me. He just checked the windows, locked them twice, and said, "This park kills the ones who talk back," which was his way of welcoming me, I guess, because when I met the other rangers later, they weren't any more reassuring. All of them worn, hollow-eyed, drinking too much coffee or whiskey, staring into the woods like they expected something to walk out any minute, and I remember thinking, how bad can one forest be, until I took my first night patrol along Trail 9, a narrow dirt path winding through thick pines and deadfall, where the trees grew too close together, the branches twisting upward like skeletal arms, scraping against one another in the wind, sounding less like trees and more like voices whispering, and twice on that patrol I heard footsteps behind me, not animal, because they were too heavy, too deliberate, but when I turned around, flashlight sweeping through the brush, there was nothing, no eye shine, no tracks, nothing but stillness that felt staged, like something was holding its breath, waiting for me to keep walking, and I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it was elk or deer spooked by human presence, until I saw the claw marks on one of the pines, vertical slashes 10 feet up, deep enough to expose pale wood beneath the bark, and I don't know of any animal around here that stands 10 feet tall, and I wish that was the worst part of that night, but it wasn't, because at exactly 2:37 a.m., as I radioed in to report the damage, the forest fell silent, no wind, no insects, no birds, nothing, like someone pressed mute on the entire world, and then a voice echoed from deeper in the woods, a voice that sounded exactly like mine, calling my own name, in my own pitch, my own tone, but stretched, distorted, like someone dragging a human voice through broken glass, and every survival instinct I had screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move, I felt pinned, frozen like prey, and the voice kept calling, closer, clearer, "Daniel, come here! Daniel!" And when it reached the edge of the trail, something snapped inside me and I bolted, sprinting full speed until I reached the ranger truck, where I locked the doors, shaking so violently I could barely get the key into the ignition, and I drove back to the cabin without even logging the event, too afraid that speaking it out loud would make it real. But when I walked inside, pale, drenched, trembling, Thomas didn't ask what happened. He just poured a glass of cheap whiskey and pushed it toward me, because he already knew, he had seen whatever I saw, maybe dozens of times, and before I could swallow the drink, he said, "If something calls you by name, it means it was watching you before you knew it existed." And over the next few days, I learned the rules of the forest, not from manuals or training sessions, but from whispered warnings, scribbled notes on sticky pads, and the haunted stories of the senior rangers, who told me never to follow voices, never to chase moving lights, never to investigate missing calls for help alone, and above all, never wander off trail without chalking your path, because the woods don't just hide things, they rearrange themselves, like they're alive, shifting paths, reshaping landmarks, trapping anything foolish enough to stray. And of course, I broke that rule 6 nights later, when we got a distress call at 1:12 a.m. from a young couple camping near the lake, who claimed something large was circling their tent, breathing, growling, scraping claws along the nylon, and protocols say to wait for backup, but the nearest ranger was 30 minutes out, and the screaming on the radio sounded too real, too terrified, so I grabbed my rifle, flashlight, and chalk, and sprinted toward the lake trail, which was a terrible decision not because of the creature, but because the chalk didn't work. The marks faded almost instantly, swallowed by the damp bark, disappearing behind me like the forest refused to be marked, and halfway there, the screaming abruptly stopped, replaced by silence, and then low, guttural laughter, not human, not animal, something in between. And when I reached the campsite, the tent was shredded, torn open like tissue paper, sleeping bags ripped apart, backpacks scattered, a trail of blood splattered across the dirt leading into the trees, but there were no bodies, no signs of a struggle, not even footprints, which was impossible given the amount of blood, and I radioed for backup, voice shaking. But before I could finish, I heard something behind me, not footsteps, not branches breaking, but breathing, slow, heavy, inches from my neck, and I turned, expecting to see whatever monster had done this, but instead, I saw a girl standing at the tree line, barefoot, wearing shorts and a tank top soaked in blood, her hair tangled, her eyes wide, whispering, "It took him," and as I stepped forward, she repeated it louder, more frantic, "It took him, it took him, it took him," pointing into the woods. But when I lifted my flashlight, she grabbed my wrist with unnatural strength, her grip cold, bone-deep cold, whispering, "Don't look, don't chase, don't make eye contact." And before I could ask why, a scream erupted from the dark, a scream that sounded like a man being torn apart alive, and the girl covered her ears and collapsed, shaking violently, and I wanted to run, but I couldn't leave her, so I dragged her toward the trail, whispering every prayer I remembered, until we reached the lake dock, where she suddenly stopped shaking, stood up, and said, in a calm, unnatural voice, "It knows your name now," and walked into the fog, vanishing before I could stop her. And the next morning, when I told Thomas everything, he didn't act surprised, he just stared into the woods and said, "It never kills all of them, it leaves one alive so they can spread fear. Fear is how it feeds." And that's when I realized this wasn't an animal, wasn't a serial killer, wasn't a cryptid or a ghost. It was something older, something that learned our language, mimicked our voices, used our fear like bait. And that night, as I tried to sleep, I heard it again, knocking on the cabin walls, 3 slow knocks, followed by my voice whispering through the cracks, "Daniel, open the door." The night after I heard my own voice whispering from outside the cabin, I barely slept, because every time I shut my eyes, I saw that girl's face in the fog, blank, calm, unbothered by terror that should have broken her, and I wondered if she had been controlled, possessed, or hollowed out by whatever lived in those woods, because no normal survivor walks away from horror without shaking, screaming, begging for help. Yet she vanished into fog like she belonged to it, like she was returning home, to something ancient, and the more I thought about her words, "It knows your name now," the more I realized why the older rangers refused to learn each other's names, why they referred to new recruits as Kid or Rook instead of Daniel or Sarah or whatever. Because names were power here. Names were signals, invitations, weaknesses, and somehow this creature, whatever it was, learned them and used them, but not the way humans use names. Not for communication, but for manipulation, like a wolf learning the call of a sheep. And the next day, I found proof that the girl existed, not as a hallucination, but as a person, because Rangers Davis and Miller returned from their sweep and reported finding a single footprint trail leading toward the lake, a woman's bare feet, small, light, short stride, and they followed it until it disappeared at the edge of the dock like she walked straight into the lake, and I wanted to tell them everything, but something about the way they looked at me, skeptical but afraid, made me hold back, because part of surviving in Silent Lake wasn't sharing truth. It was pretending nothing was wrong. And later that afternoon, I heard two rangers arguing in the supply shed, whispering about the increase, the hunter's hunger, and the full moon cycle, and when they noticed me, they stopped talking completely, like children caught telling secrets, which confirmed what I suspected. They knew far more than they ever reported, but fear, pride, and bureaucracy kept them quiet, because Silent Lake wasn't just dangerous, it was classified, the kind of place state officials didn't want headlines about, because headlines bring investigators, investigators bring questions, and questions bring attention, and attention is dangerous when you're trying to hide something monstrous, something that kills tourists every year, something no one can explain, identify, or trap. And as the sun set over the water, turning the lake blood orange, Thomas approached me with a notebook, old, leather-bound, pages yellowed, filled with messy handwriting and drawings that looked like claws, teeth, and symbols, accompanied by numbers, dates, names crossed out, lines connecting deaths like a conspiracy map, and he said, "This was Ranger Cordell's log, the man who worked here before me, before all of us. He kept records of every disappearance, every scream, every sighting, until the woods finally took him." And he handed it to me as if passing a cursed object, and I flipped through it, reading entries describing shadow figures with glowing eyes, tall humanoid shapes stalking hikers, mimicking voices, baiting people into the trees, and one phrase written over and over, "It doesn't hunt to eat, it hunts to learn," which didn't make sense at first, until I remembered how it used my voice, how it mimicked screams, breaths, whispers, like a predator studying prey, refining technique, growing smarter with each kill, and Cordell wasn't the only one who saw it, because over the next week, former rangers, locals, even campers described similar sightings. A tall, gaunt figure with elongated limbs, moving silently, unnaturally, too fast, too smooth, and always at night when fog covered the ground. Because fog here wasn't weather, fog was camouflage, fog was the staging ground for its hunts, and the deeper I read, the more one detail stood out. The creature didn't kill randomly. It stalked groups, camps, families, but left survivors intentionally, and those survivors either vanished later, described voices calling them back, or worse, killed others under strange circumstances, as if infected with madness, compelled to drag more victims into the woods. And that's when I realized the girl wasn't lucky, she wasn't spared. She was selected, marked, transformed into bait, and that thought terrified me more than anything else. Because what if I had already been marked too? What if answering the voice, even by accident, meant I was its next messenger, its next puppet? And I tried to push those thoughts away, distract myself with routine, patrols, paperwork, but Silent Lake wasn't done with me. It wasn't done with any of us, because 3 nights later, during a full moon, we received a distress call that shattered every illusion of safety left in this park, a call from a group of college kids camping near Hollow Point Ridge, who screamed over the radio that something large was circling their tents, dragging its claws across trees, growling, laughing, speaking, and when we asked for details, all we heard was chaos. People running, crying, someone shouting, "It's using my voice! It's using my voice!" And then a blood-curdling scream so loud it distorted the mic, followed by silence so complete it felt dead, and Thomas ordered every ranger on duty to gear up and move out, and we raced through the woods in trucks until the trail became too narrow, then continued on foot, guns raised, light sweeping beams of white across black bark and dense fog, and halfway to the ridge, we smelled it, blood, thick iron musk, fresh, and then we heard it, a wet dragging sound, like bodies being pulled through leaves, and as we reached the clearing, our flashlights landed on something so grotesque it broke men who had seen combat, because 3 bodies were laid out in a circle, arranged deliberately, anatomically wrong, limbs bent backwards, jaws unhinged unnaturally wide, eyes missing, but not eaten, collected, placed in a pile, like trophies, like offerings, and carved into the dirt between them was a symbol. 2 vertical lines intersected by a crooked spiral, the same symbol, drawn repeatedly in Cordell's notebook, and before any of us could process it, we heard footsteps, heavy, fast, circling us in the dark, and then voices, dozens of voices, human voices, overlapping, whispering, laughing, calling our names, names we never told anyone, and panic erupted, rangers firing blindly into trees, screaming for it to show itself, but bullets didn't stop it, because when it finally stepped into the clearing, illuminated by 6 flashlights, it wasn't flesh, it wasn't animal. It wasn't anything that should exist. It was tall, skeletal, skin stretched tight over bone, but shifting, changing, rippling like liquid shadow, face smooth like a mask until it split open into a jagged grin, revealing a mouth too wide, too toothless, like something that swallowed prey whole, and its eyes weren't eyes, they were empty sockets with faint red glow inside, like embers in a dying fire, and I swear to God it smiled at us, amused, unafraid, and then it spoke, butchered, disjointed, in a dozen voices at once. "Hello, Daniel." And the rangers froze because they realized I wasn't just unlucky. I was targeted, marked, hunted, and then everything fell apart, because it moved. Faster than anything I'd ever seen, slashing throats, ripping limbs, throwing men like rag dolls, and in less than 60 seconds, 5 rangers were dead, and the rest fled, screaming, stumbling, falling over each other, because all bravery, all training, all experience means nothing when you face something that doesn't bleed, doesn't slow, doesn't fear you, and I ran, not because I'm a coward, but because staying meant dying without answers, dying without warning the next poor souls, and as I sprinted toward the trucks, I heard it behind me, imitating the dying, screaming, laughing, calling my name again and again, as if savoring the chase, and I reached the truck, dove inside, slammed the door, and sped off, tires skidding through mud, branches shattering against the windshield. And when I reached the station, covered in blood and dirt, gasping, shaking, Thomas didn't ask what happened. He just stared at me with hollow, resigned eyes and said, "It's awake again." And that sentence implied something I wasn't ready to understand. This wasn't the first massacre, this wasn't a rare event, this was a cycle, a ritual, something that happened every few years when whatever lives in this forest grows hungry, and the government, the Park Service, everyone knows. But they don't close the park, because closing it means admitting something supernatural exists, and humans don't accept monsters until they're dead in front of them. So Silent Lake stays open, year after year, tourist after tourist, sacrifice after sacrifice, because a handful of disappearances every summer is acceptable, manageable, variable under paperwork and excuses, and as I sat in that station, drenched in blood that wasn't mine, surrounded by rangers too afraid to speak, I realized something crucial. We weren't protectors, we were cleanup crew, damage control, witnesses to death we couldn't stop, only delay, and none of us were going to survive long enough to retire, because the forest doesn't let go, it doesn't forget, it doesn't forgive, and now it had my name, my voice, my scent, and it would hunt me until either I died or I disappeared into its fog forever, just like Ranger Cordell, the college kids, the girl, and every other soul swallowed by Silent Lake. In the days following the massacre at Hollow Point Ridge, the ranger station transformed from a silent, lonely outpost into a crowded war room filled with fear, confusion, and denial, because for the first time in years, there were survivors. Me, Thomas, and 3 new rangers who had only been on the job for less than a month, and the moment they realized the full terror of Silent Lake, 2 of them immediately requested transfers, while the third pretended to be fine but vomited in the restroom every few hours, and it was almost funny, in a bleak, suicidal way, because none of them would be transferred, not because of paperwork or bureaucracy, but because this place didn't let people leave once they had seen the truth, and Thomas confirmed this when he told me, in a hushed voice, that every ranger who survived a massacre was retained for observation, which was code for no one leaves, not alive, not sane, not intact. And the federal government wasn't just aware of deaths here, they monitored them, concealed them, studied them, because the entity living in Silent Lake wasn't just a local cryptid or backwoods legend, it was considered a national threat, something classified, something ancient, something scientists called an anomaly, not a creature, because a creature implies biology, evolution, weakness, but this thing didn't operate like a predator or animal, it operated like an intelligence, something patient, strategic, with long-term patterns and selective memory, storing names, voices, laughs the way humans store tools, and as terrifying as that was, it was nothing compared to what Thomas revealed next. Silent Lake wasn't the only place where this entity existed, because similar massacres had been recorded in forests across Montana, Colorado, parts of Alaska, and even remote Canadian national parks, always the same signs: missing eyes, rearranged bodies, unnatural symbols, and survivors that disappeared weeks later, drawn back by whispers, compelled to return to the site of the horror, like moths to flame, because once marked, you didn't escape, you just delayed inevitability. And when I asked Thomas why rangers weren't armed with flamethrowers, explosives, or something more powerful than standard rifles, he shook his head and said, "We've tried everything, it doesn't die because it doesn't live." And that sentence rattled me more than the massacre, because it implied that the entity wasn't measured by life or death, but existence, a force that simply changes forms, relocates, hibernates, feeds, sleeps, and returns, unaffected by physical damage, untouched by fear. And I asked him outright if the government ever attempted to close the park, and he laughed, bitter, defeated, and said, "Do you know how many national parks in this country have missing persons cases nobody talks about?" And he listed them off: Yosemite, Yellowstone, Great Smoky Mountains. Massive, beautiful tourist magnets hiding thousands of disappearances that weren't accidents or animal attacks, but something older, stranger, and suddenly our little corner of hell didn't feel isolated, it felt connected to something global, maybe even ancient. And while he spoke, I stared at the map pinned to the wall, covered with red markers representing disappearances, and I noticed something alarming. They formed a shape, a spiral, the same spiral carved into the dirt at the massacre site, and represented dozens of symbols in Cordell's notebook. And when I pointed it out, Thomas nodded and said the shape wasn't random, because every incident, every death, every survivor wasn't chaos, it was ritual, structure, intelligence, and survivors like me weren't lucky. We were essential components, because the entity needed people to escape, to spread, to witness, and something in me rebelled at the idea that this wasn't random violence but purposeful design, which made the idea of calling law enforcement futile. Because how do you report something that doesn't have a face, body, or species? And what police chief would dispatch officers to hunt shadows, voices, fog, and then hide the bodies they wouldn't be able to identify anyway? And though the massacre left us broken, we weren't the only ones reacting, because 2 days after, a team of unmarked SUVs arrived, driven by men in suits with dull expressions and government silence in their eyes, and they asked us questions not about the creature or the victims, but about what we saw, heard, smelled, felt, thought, dreamed, and their fixation on the survivors rather than the dead convinced me they didn't care about saving lives, only studying the phenomenon, because the entity wasn't just a threat, it was a subject of research, and witnessing its behavior was a privilege paid for in other people's blood. And one of the agents spoke directly to me, calling me by my name without being introduced, implying I was already in their system, and he said, "When it mimicked your voice, did it sound identical or distorted?" And the clinical tone in his voice made me snap, because I screamed at him, demanding answers, demanding solutions, demanding to know what the hell we were dealing with, and he responded with the coldest, most horrifying sentence I'd ever heard: "We don't know what it is, only what it does. And what it does is kill, stalk, mimic, manipulate, recruit, and vanish without trace." And when the agents left, they ordered the station closed temporarily, not to investigate, not to exterminate, but to manage media, because a group of college kids missing could generate noise, news, families demanding answers, but missing hikers, campers, people who had no one, no family, no online presence, those disappearances were easier, quieter, disposable, and Silent Lake fed best on disposable lives. And the more I observed, the clearer the pattern became. The forest wasn't the monster, the government wasn't the victim, and humanity wasn't the hero. We were cattle that both the entity and authority harvested for different reasons, and I realized the only person who ever tried to stop it was Cordell, the ranger who vanished years ago, because he had tracked cycles, names, dates, patterns, and was close to discovering something, maybe too close, because the last entry in his notebook read, "It learns faster every time." And that's when Thomas told me the truth behind the entity's nature, what the locals called it, what missing hikers whispered before dying, what the forest people feared above all else, the echo, because it didn't just mimic voices, it mimicked identity, it became you, it studied you, it hollowed you out, and then it spoke through you. So survivors weren't lucky. They were infected, and I realized with sickening clarity why the agents questioned me, why Thomas looked at me differently, why the new rangers stepped back when I entered a room, because they didn't fear the creature, they feared I might become it, not physically but behaviorally, gradually, unconsciously, until one day my voice wasn't mine, my intentions weren't mine, my reflection wasn't mine, and that thought haunted me every waking minute, especially as the forest grew louder, because the silence that once defined Silent Lake was gone, replaced by noises that didn't belong in any natural ecosystem, not wolves, not coyotes, not elk, but something deeper, guttural, broken, like an animal learning to growl for the first time. And every day, the woods grew bolder, creeping closer to the station, leaving signs, symbols, remnants as if reminding us, I'm still here. And the tension among rangers reached a breaking point when Davis, one of the survivors, snapped during a night shift and opened fire into the trees, screaming at shadows, believing he heard his dead brother calling him. And when we tackled him down, pinned him to the ground, he cried and mumbled, "It knows everything about me," and later that night, he placed a gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger, because death was safer than becoming a vessel, a puppet, a mouthpiece, and when we found his body, eyes missing, I realized the forest retrieved them not because it needed them, but because it honored him, because Davis belonged to it now, and from that moment, reality began collapsing, not just in the forest, but in the minds of everyone left, because we started seeing the dead in our dreams, hearing their voices in the showers, watching them pass by windows, not ghosts but imitations, prototypes, rehearsals, and Thomas, who once held everything together with stern calmness, now stared into nothing for hours, whispering to someone I couldn't see, until finally, he confessed something that shattered me. It doesn't need to kill the body to take you. It just needs your fear. And that's when I realized this story wasn't about a creature hunting flesh, it was about an intelligence hunting minds, carving itself into our memories, rewriting identity, because if it could replicate voices, why not thoughts, behavior, humanity, and maybe that's why it leaves survivors, not for mercy, but because evolution requires iteration, and survivors are prototypes for the next model. And while I wrestled with that realization, the agents returned, not to help, but to initiate containment protocol, which meant evacuating civilians while leaving the remaining rangers behind to distract the entity, because we weren't employees anymore, we were sacrifices. And that night, when the lake flooded with unnatural fog and the trees began to shift, as if bending toward us, preparing for another hunt, I understood the final truth. This wasn't a horror story with a climax, battle, or victory, because this was a cycle, a ritual, a system built on repetition, and humanity wasn't fighting a monster, we were feeding it, generation after generation, pretending nature is safe, pretending parks are peaceful, while something older than language watches us build trails through its territory, laughing, waiting, calling out our names from the dark. And now that it had me, my name, my voice, my memories, it wouldn't stop until I answered, until I walked into the woods willingly, because that's how it wins, not by force, but by invitation, by seduction, by imitation. And as insane as it sounds, I could feel it calling me, not outside, but inside my head, whispering with my mother's voice, with the screams of the dead rangers, with the girl who said, "It knows your name now," because she wasn't warning me, she was welcoming me. And I realized the horror wasn't what lived in Silent Lake. The horror was knowing that soon, I would join it. The storm had rolled over Redwood Basin like an animal breathing fire, and the trees bent beneath the violence of the wind as the remaining rangers, Mason, Evelyn, and Carter, pushed deeper into the burned perimeter toward the heart of the forest where the screams had come from, and everything around them smelled like wet ash and iron, like something old had woken up beneath the crushed soil. And as they walked past charred trunks, Mason saw shadows moving between the trees, and he remembered the audio logs they found in the ranger station basement, where the missing rangers spoke of the Watchers, ancient guardians that tore flesh to preserve the land, and he wondered whether their torches were lights of civilization or signals of trespass, because every step sounded like a trigger under their boots, and when they found the burnt clearing with the blackened totem still standing, 8 feet tall, carved from twisted roots with human jaws embedded at the top, Evelyn whispered, "It wants a tribute," and before any of them could speak, the air rippled and figures stepped from the dark. Dozens of tall, lank creatures with semi-human faces stretched too thin, bodies wrapped in moss and bone, moving with the silence of predators that did not need sound to communicate, and Mason felt their thoughts invade his mind, telling him that the fire had awakened the hunger, that humans had fed the soil for too long and the forest wanted repayment, and the creatures dragged forward the people they had taken, the hikers, campers, and even the missing rangers, still breathing but blindfolded with sap-covered cloth, trembling as if aware of their fate, and Carter raised his rifle and screamed at them to stop, but a branch shot from the ground like a spear, impaling him through the leg and dragging him screaming across the dirt, while Mason ran forward to pull him free, only to be swarmed by nightmares with fingers like knives, slicing at his jacket, tearing skin, and everything became chaos. As Evelyn lit a flare and threw it toward the totem, and the flare didn't burn red but sickly green, lighting the clearing with unnatural glow, revealing bodies nailed high in the canopy, hundreds of them, skeletal and twisted, trophies of generations, and Mason realized that the totem wasn't just art, it was a door, and burning it earlier had opened something buried beneath the roots, letting the Watchers roam freely instead of being trapped, and Evelyn pulled from her pack the last can of thermite, saying that if they lit it, the whole basin would ignite, animals, plants, monsters and all, and Mason could see she meant it, because she would rather reduce the park to a crater than let the evil spread to towns and cities. But before they could act, the ground burst open and a colossal creature, made of root, fur, and bone, rose like a wolf built from the skeleton of a tree, towering above them with antlers that scraped clouds, its eyes glowing white and its breath steaming like boiling blood, and Mason felt his knees lock from primal fear, and the creature spoke without sound, pressing its voice into his skull, telling him humans were parasites, burning, cutting, destroying, and the time had come to harvest the taker, not the taken. But Evelyn screamed, "We protect, not consume," and triggered the thermite, the blast turning the clearing into a furnace, flames shooting in a column that lit the sky like dawn, the monsters shrieking with animal hatred as their bodies melted into sludge, and the giant beast roared loud enough to shake the mountain, its flesh splitting and roots unraveling. But instead of dying, it lunged through the fire straight at Mason, jaws wide, and everything slowed to a heartbeat as he realized that there was no winning, only delaying the inevitable. But Carter, crawling and bleeding, grabbed Evelyn's flare and jammed it into an exposed root, triggering another blast that split the creature open and sent burning bone raining from the sky, and Mason dragged Carter and Evelyn from the explosion as flames consumed the clearing, trees collapsing, ash falling like black snow, and they collapsed at the cliff edge, watching the forest burn, knowing the fire would spread and every living thing inside would die, guilty yet relieved, because silence was better than what lived inside. But then a final scream, not human, not animal, ripped through the valley and died like thunder, and the wind carried with it the smell of centuries ending. And when dawn finally came, helicopters passed overhead, unaware of what had died to keep them safe, and Mason, Evelyn, and Carter were rushed to a hospital where none of them spoke of the creatures, the fire, or the meaning of the carvings, because nobody would believe them. Nobody would understand that the forest wasn't haunted, it was alive, and what they killed was only one of many guardians slumbering beneath the loam. And 6 months later, Mason sat alone on the porch of a rehabilitation cabin, staring at the news report that a new forest had begun growing over the burned crater, faster than natural, roots sprouting in weeks, and the headline read, "Miracle Regrowth." But Mason saw in the photo faint silhouettes between the newborn trees, watching, waiting, rebuilding, and he shut off the screen, whispering to himself that they hadn't stopped the massacre, only paused it, because nature doesn't forgive, it remembers, and somewhere deep under the new roots, something old and hungry was waking again, smiling with a skull full of teeth, counting days until humans walked back into its mouth.